Ahoy! Recently I talked about the weapon artifacts in New World, and today we're going to take a look at the armor artifacts and rate them in a tier list as to how I roughly think they perform at the moment. Of course, this is subjective, there's a lot of feeling going into something like this, but I just wanted to give you a very general idea of where I would place these. We're beginning with Grey Wizard's Hat. You can always see the item on the right side, and that is immediately one of the weakest options. In my opinion, the extra max mana doesn't really give you much, and the extra intelligence is just not enough to really be valuable in any build currently. And I don't know of anyone using this at all. So, relatively easy one where we don't need to spend too much time on. It could be more interesting if the mana was scaling slightly differently, but as of now I don't really know of any build that utilizes this well. Next up is Featherweight. Initially I rated this way too low. This is definitely one of the best artifacts in the game and one of the most commonly used ones, just because it allows you to wear heavy pieces in light and significantly increase your overall mitigations, and that's mainly what it's used for. There are some other niche use cases as well, but realistically, overall that's exactly the place where it fits, and it's very strong at that. And even other options that are meant to compete don't really compete so far. It's strong in both, especially PvP, but also in PvE. So a lot of players like this a lot, and it's become one of the standard high tier armor artifacts. Quickdraw Gloves is one that I was initially unsure about because I couldn't really tell where it's going with that effect, if the duration is too short to be noticeable. So far, that feels like it's the case. It's just not really worth considering for most builds when Featherweight is competing with it, just giving you more consistent mitigation uptime that overall mitigates way more damage for most players. I still think that there's a technical use case for Quickdraw Gloves for a healer with a rapier offhand, for just an insane amount of immunity if you're getting targeted, but with the cooldown that it has and everything, I think it's just very difficult to execute effectively, again, competing with Featherweight here. Koya's knee guards I'm not really gonna rate, because at the moment I would put them C or D tier. I don't think they're good at all. Just the values that they actually ended up with, considering these 10% seem to be the right value now, are just not good enough. But they are getting a buff in the very next patch, so I don't really want to place them here, because that buff might put them up here for all we know. So I'm going to put them back here, and we're just going to leave them here as a question mark basically, and that will be determined after the next patch. If you're enjoying the video so far, consider subscribing and clicking the bell, and if you'd like to support me further, you can do so on Patreon and get early trading tips in return. I just posted another one the other day, so that could be useful for you. Tumbler Feetwraps are still a pretty good artifact. In light specifically, probably the most competing option with Featherweight. Obviously just PvP specific, but I do believe that while they're not as valued anymore since the bug has been fixed, they overall still offer a lot of utility, a lot of effects in a single item that make them very, very strong and a very good option. And they would possibly be S tier if it wasn't for Featherweight existing in the same weight class. Djinn Headwrap I think is a solid B tier, right in the middle here. It doesn't have the nicest perks on it itself, because you have Vigor and Invigorated locked. So I think that's a bit annoying, in combination with a shrug off effect that obviously makes sense, but it is a bit limiting in terms of how much mitigation you can put on it. But there are some people that really like the shrug off effect, especially reducing the duration of weekends and so on. That's very, very nice and rents. The problem is that the builds that benefit most from this would be medium or heavy builds, but at the moment medium isn't very there at all, pretty much. And heavy builds obviously take a bit of a hit by running medium headwear, whereas light builds don't benefit from these effects as much in my opinion. For example, rend doesn't matter that much to light anyways, because their armor is low to begin with. So you can put this in a light build as well, I guess, but I would not like it as much as in a light build as I would like it in a medium or heavy build. So if like medium comes back with the upcoming changes, then this might be seen quite a fair bit more. Nimble Leather Coat is pretty much S tier for specifically PvE speedrunning content. It is relatively strong in certain builds, but then not so strong in others that don't benefit as much from the cool interaction. Like with the greatsword build, you don't need that much, whereas with a rapier build, you can basically get way more of it. So overall, I would say it's an A tier artifact. I don't think it's the best there is, but for certain builds, it's just very, very good and very useful in PvE. In PvP, I don't rate it as highly. I'm sure you can still run it, but it wouldn't be my first priority. Ghoul Gloves is, on paper, such a cool artifact. I really love that effect. The problem is just that it's extremely conditional, with the enemy having to be under half health, you having to have a debuff applied to yourself in order to be able to transfer one, and you have a 3 seconds cooldown, so you're not gonna get much benefit out of that most of the time. I would much rather have an overall meta where most artifacts work like Ghoul Gloves. They give you something unique, specific, not game-breaking by itself. Whereas at the moment, I think there's too many one-size-fits-all artifacts. Look at the ones up here. They don't really do anything particularly unique, anything like that. They just give you an insane amount of whatever, mitigation, safe healing, cool interaction. I think Ghoul Gloves does that much, much better, but it's just not very good. I'm kind of torn between C and D tier here. I think it's not completely horrible still. I think there might be more arguments for this than for the Withered Head, so maybe we'll give it a low C tier, but really somewhere in between the two. Attuned leather pants are also some of the most popular ones out there. I think they've kind of gone down in use a bit with more specialized builds coming out, but some builds still use them very, very well. I would say somewhere between here, one of the two really. I probably put them into high A, but it also depends on PvP, PvE angle, so you could argue in that regard as well, and some builds just use them better than others. Again, the only difference between this and Featherweight really is that Featherweight just works well for pretty much all light builds, and Attuned leather pants has some more limitations where it's not as good. You need to make use of enough different attribute capstones for this to be useful. Winged leather shoes are a meme, I'm sorry, but a haste effect that doesn't even do anything that you can't get on your ring or whatever, and then, yeah, it's just... The only thing this is useful for is gathering. People like to run faster while gathering because the haste lasts longer between picking up different items. So for farm runs this is good, but this is a list rated on PvP and PvE and not on farm runs, so you're not going to get any credit for that here. This is going to be a D tier, and I'm just putting it in front of the wizard's head because you can use it for farm runs. I don't know what they were thinking with this. And every time they've talked about this artifact, they've talked about it as if it has more effects than just that. Like something about cool interaction at some point, even though it just has refreshing on it. And then they mentioned something else, but really there isn't much to it, unfortunately. Unyielding is a very good artifact. The problem is that it's not really useful where it would be useful the most. So with it, how it works in terms of mitigation, it's not necessarily the best all-rounder in heavy. It's because you already get so much crit mitigation in heavy that it's often not getting its full effect. In light is where you would want to use it the most, and you can do that now, but then it's competing with Featherweight, and Featherweight again is just a better all-rounder because it counters non-crits as well. And then you kind of end up again with medium not being used much at the moment. So I would say it's an A tier artifact. It's definitely up there, maybe like towards the end of A at the moment. Definitely could have its time in the sun, but it just can't really compete with Featherweight for the most part, and it can't really compete with other options in heavy. I'm kind of thinking maybe you can put it down here. It's floating. It's floating depending on what's being used at the moment. I think with Fire Staff being fairly prominent still, there's a good argument to keep it up here for now, but it could also drop down. So this one could also gain significant value if we see nerfs to Featherweight, and also with the devs talking about making potential changes for light assassins being more viable. That might be more possible through Unyielding if you can reduce the crit damage so you don't get spiked as hard. So we'll see, but I'll put it here for now. Void Darkplate is just an insanely good all-rounder. It just gives you more armor. That's it. It does well in heavy. It does well in medium if you were inclined to use that. So yeah, not much to say about it. Again, it's not very unique or interesting, but it also comes with Enchanted Ward. That's always beneficial. I've done the numbers before, so we don't need to talk about that in detail. But yeah, Void Darkplate is just good. It just is raw mitigation. It's good in PvP and in PvE. So magnetic gauntlets are a little bit weird because they are good in pretty much one build, which is the Void Gauntlet build, which relies on crit and quick resets. For most other purposes, they just aren't all that great. There aren't that many other heavily crit-focused builds where it would be particularly effective. Had some issues with the damage reduction, scaling too high. I think that's sorted out now, though. But yeah, they are good for that, so I'm going to put them in B tier, because for that purpose, they're basically S tier. For everything else, they're kind of just meh. But yeah, that one purpose, probably even in front of Djinn Headwrap, to be honest. But yeah, that one purpose is enough to justify them here. Freedom pants are kind of dependent on your playstyle and build and everything. I found them to not feel as impactful as I expected, but that's more a problem with what kind of CC is popular at the moment. We have a lot of staggers at the moment. Also depends on which game mode you're playing. So I would say they're at least good. I probably would put them somewhere either here or here. I don't think they're like the best out there. Maybe we just put them at the front of B tier. I think they're definitely an option worth considering. If you're a war player, then they're probably more up here. Maybe just put them here. It's kind of in between there. It's really a toss-up depending on the situation. But like in small scale, I would not prefer freedom as much. In larger scale combat, if you are someone who's heavily affected by freedom, I would prefer it more. But then it's also not that much better than Djinn. So, no, we put it here. But like somewhere between. The Unmoved remains a massive question mark to me. I haven't gotten them yet. I haven't been able to fully test how they actually work now. I will do that in the near future though, because I have someone to test it with. But as far as I have been told, they aren't really fully fixed. And if that's the case, I don't think they get a high rating, because they're only effective against a very specific handful of effects. So I would put them like maybe like C tier around here. But again, I am not sure about this because I haven't been able to fully test them. So I'm not going to place them there right now. I will put them down here, and we'll talk about them more in the future. Of course, we also have the artifacts here. The first one of those, Ankh, is definitely a strong one. It got quite a few nerfs over time. Overall, I think it's an A tier now. It's still very much a good one, but it's not strictly necessary anymore for every build like it used to be pretty much for a while. Since it has quite a few downsides, the healing isn't quite as high. We have some anti-heal going around now, so there's a few arguments against using it now, but it's definitely still good. Lost Stopwatch is still kind of weird and incredibly niche. I think the effect on itself is very little application, especially with the stun duration being changed to an extra 1 second now. What I think has some value is the taunt gem activation for certain builds in PvE, so I don't think it's entirely useless, but overall definitely one of the weaker options that you can use. Blooddrinker is interesting. Apparently it works differently again now. I have been hearing that supposedly it's working with AoE differently now, so that might be more usable again. I'm not sure, haven't tested this, but either way, I think there is definitely usability in PvE for this, especially for solo farming stuff. It's always good, but even in PvP, in certain situations, if you don't get enough healing, this can be useful. This can also be very annoying if your teammates decide to use it in PvE and you're the only DPS not running it and everything is going way slower, but you're taking more hits because it's going slower and they're just healing up and you're not really aware of them doing that. So if you're running this in PvE in a group, then it's good to communicate that so that everyone is at least on the same page when it comes to using it or not using it. I do not like Endless Thirst. Endless Thirst increases the cooldown of your potions and makes them stronger in return. And I do not like this trade-off at all. But I am aware that people are using it, and I am aware that some people like it. I'm not going to get my personal bias in the way here. I think overall this is probably a solid B as well. I think this is middle ground. Don't think this is Lost Stopwatch level. Lost Stopwatch could almost go down further, and then maybe we could make an argument for Endless Thirst going down further. But I believe that Endless Thirst isn't really worth it, especially with the other perks in it as well. I don't like it. It's not my build or play style at all. So not for me, but I do think there are use cases, there are play styles that can utilize that well. some people really like it in Arena, so we'll give it a B tier. In the next days or in the new year, we'll talk about a very problematic bug that is in New World at the moment that could make things worse, much worse rather, in the near future if it's not sorted out. So if you're interested in that, consider subscribing, clicking the bell, and we'll also be talking a little bit more about artifacts and upgrades. If you'd like to support me further, you can do so on my Patreon and get early trading tips and all of your questions answered in return. Thanks to all of my patrons who already do exactly that. And thank you for watching. Dukesloth out.